Our first speaker is Denise Decaires Narain, who's a senior lecturer in English at the University of Sussex. Denise has published very widely on Caribbean, specifically Caribbean women's writing, and her book, Contemporary Caribbean Women's Poetry Making Style, was the first kind of major study of Caribbean women's poetry. Her monograph on the Jamaican short story writer and poet Olive Senior was published in 2012. And she's currently working on lots of different projects, actually, including an absolutely fascinating one on the relationship between mistresses and female servants in post-colonial fiction. But most relevantly for our gathering, she's also working on that ongoing contestation over the relevance of categories post-colonial and queer in relation to Caribbean writing, and has published an article which I would recommend you all to go and have a look at, called Naming Same-Sex Desire in Caribbean Women's Texts Towards a Creolizing Hermeneutics, which was published in a special issue of Contemporary Women's Writing last year.
So I suppose what it does is takes issue with the word queer, not because I want to make some kind of anti-queer kind of platform, but more that I want to suggest that maybe revitalizing what I'm calling a creolizing hermeneutics, a kind of way of reading for the creolizing potential, is what I'm trying to think about. And partly because I think queer isn't a word that has any kind of historical, doesn't have the same historical meanings in the Caribbean that it does in England and the US. So I think it's a word that has a very particular kind of freight historically. So that's one kind of thing. So it's not to say that I want that I think necessarily that anything that comes from outside is automatically suspect, but I'm just not sure that queer can do the kind of work that we want it to do in the context of Caribbean writing that perhaps creolization and creolizing can do. I think that, as I understand queer theory, it also seems to me to be not a discourse that gets away from a kind of liberal concept of the subject in quite the way that I think it presents itself as doing. So it seems to me that it's often, despite itself, engaged in a kind of telos that is progressive, that suggests that that the queer subject is sort of beyond identity categories, beyond essentializing understandings of the subject, that it goes beyond identity politics. And that it seems to me is not always evident in queer theory itself. It seems to me that it can't get away from that idea of the liberal subject, that conception of how we think about subjectivity. So I prefer to think about freeing up sexuality in a wider project of liberations or expansions that open up trajectories that are not temporally bound in a chronological fashion, which seems to me that queer theory does suggest that there is a better, more liberated kind of subject, in the beyond. But that beyond has a very particular history, right? So it's that kind of point that I want to hang on to. Whereas I think in the Caribbean that the idea of subjectivity is a much more fraught, splintered and contested one. Even if you think just in terms of, the kind of degendering of subjectivity in plantation slavery, just right the way through, there is a need, I think, to think before rather than forward, if that makes sense. Okay, so in a sense, what I'm trying to do is to think about how we might reconceptualize creolization outside of the ways in which we've become used to thinking about it. And to think instead about a kind of a contemporaneity of creolization. In other words, to think about past, present, and future in a kind of creolized idea of temporality, right? Which is a difficult one to conceptualize, but perhaps people like Wilson Harris, and I can't believe I'm actually promoting Wilson Harris, somebody I've wrestled with for such a long time. But I think his idea of the kind of a cultural hybridity that is not bound by capital H history is a very useful one. Okay, so it seems to me that this might allow a more forgiving apprehension of the past. I think also that revisiting creolization with a different kind of map, with a different set of textual examples, might allow us to release more of its potential than we are used to doing. Particularly if we can pay attention in the kind of intimate engagement with text that Alison was referring to earlier, where we can kind of see in that singular, intimate moment of reading all kinds of knotted possibilities, however fleeting. This is not something that I think that sits well in the academic context in which we all, well, some of us live and work in. Well, all of us, I guess. I don't know where, yeah. I don't know where you're all from, so I mustn't assume. But it seems to me that academic careers are made out of being very definite about what you think, capital T theory rather than small t, that you're making an intervention that is bold and cutting edge, all those stupid, in my opinion, words. So that there's not much space for the kind of humility and intimacy and small-scale engagement with text that I think might unleash more interesting possibilities. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. You know, to put humble with academic is not an easy coupling, I think, if you want promotion. Okay, so in a sense what I'm suggesting is that we read for the moments of possible hybridity that were not able to be recognized earlier because of the limited understanding of creolization available in the critical discourse of the time. So I'm thinking of, Kamar Brathwaite and people like that, and the context in which creolization became hijacked into a kind of binary opposition of Anglo-Saxons versus tribe boys, to use one shorthand phrase from a very particular debate in Savaku. So this sense of it being a very embattled, a very hyper-masculine kind of combat zone is the one that I think characterized creolization. And we're all familiar with that narrative of colonialism, colonial regimes employing a kind of emasculating strategy, which then seems to require a kind of hyper-masculine response. And it seems to me that I think those of us who worked in Caribbean women's writing, I think got caught in that binary, that sort of primary binary impasse, of Europe versus Africa. And it was very difficult to get out of it. So I think we're now in what I would call the kind of politics of adding on and adding up. So that and by that I mean that if creolization, as we understand it from people like Brathwaite, is largely about Afro and Euro cultures, then I think recent interventions have been, and I include myself in this as someone who kind of said, okay, well, women are also marginalized, so let's add them into the discourse. Now, Indo-Caribbean writing is being attended to. Same-sex desire will also be, so I'm sure you get the picture. So what I'm saying is that there is a kind of demographic that suggests numbers matter. There's a kind of maths of creolization. So there are more African Caribbeans than there are Indo, so it is right in that context that they get talked about and given, attention first, and then Indo, then Chinese, then, and eventually people like me who are of Portuguese origin will have to, belatedly, reluctantly dragging our feet say, yes, this is what we contribute to the creolization debate. That seems to me to short-circuit possibilities for smaller contributions to creolization that may have been made along the way that it has not been possible to recognize because of that Afro-Euro binary opposition that seems to squat on other possibilities. So I want to suggest that rather than a kind of politics of adding on, we might think differently about how we can deploy creolization to incorporate an attention to sexualities and sexual cultures at the same time. Because the categories seem to me to reproduce structurally there's a problem, that we keep reproducing the same problem over and over again if we don't rethink the parameters conceptually, historically, culturally, all of those kinds of things, which is a really difficult thing to imagine because I don't really know that I have a single solution. When Keon mentioned solution, I just felt such a sense of longing and yearning. Solution! I wish I could come up with a solution, So I have that with exclamation. I have no solutions. But I have suggestions, I suppose, for how we might think about it. So I suppose one way would be to think about rather than looking to gay and lesbian or queer theory, conceptually, it might be to kind of step back further and look at the foundations of the heterosexual norms that seem to me determine everything, determine a landscape in which sexuality within the Caribbean, it seems to me, kind of veers between a sort of promiscuous explicitness and a kind of uptight, conservative closed-inness. It veers between those two. And also in kind of everyday intimacies. Sexuality is not reflected on, at least I don't read very much that is very reflective on sexuality. So moments of intimacy of a sexual kind, I'm not talking about the sex act, because in some ways this may be to do with age, that seems really boring. But I think, I don't mean that old people don't have sex, but I mean that there are much more interesting and complicated, smaller registers of sexuality than the sex act, which I think is something that a lot of queer theorists have also wanted to get away from. This sense that gay and lesbian means, is focused on a way of having sex, which seems to me to be an obsession that we do well to step outside of, and to try and look at smaller moments of intimacy and kindness and love, which may also include sexual practices, but does not have to privilege those. It seems to me that the Caribbean is lacking that kind of discursive register. So in addition to those kinds of intimacies, I suppose I also want to say that I want to explore the possibility of whether a creolizing way of reading might allow us to recognize other smaller registers of creolization potential. So rather than it always being either Miss Lou, with that very kind of Louise Bennett, with that very particular kind of naturalistic use of Jamaican Creole, or on the other hand, the kind of rude boy argument of people like whoever, I don't want to name names, but just building on from the dancehall culture, that sense of a very contestatory, hyper-masculine kind of where the voice is loud, strong, where there is a kind of mileage in investing in a sort of brute force sexuality. That question that came from the floor earlier about there being a kind of status in being anti-respectability seems to me a very interesting question to have asked, and one that I think really is detrimental and to Caribbean literary culture, because of the way it encourages us to also take up this very combative kind of critical voice. Okay, so those are some of the kinds of equivocations I have around the way creolization has been used in Caribbean discourse. It seems to me that in the historical context of the Caribbean, we can't simply map queer onto the Caribbean. Not just because, as I said, I think the etymology, the historical use of the word doesn't sit easily in that context, but because the context is different. Its history of sexuality is different, and I think requires a more nimble and less all-encompassing kind of narrative. So I would argue that different contexts demand different kinds of critical discourses and different kinds of registers of discourse. I think also that queer theory has become institutionalized in such a way that it has significant power. So I suppose part of me is wanting to resist the kind of unexplored, the Yeah, the unexplored idea, it's not completely unexplored because lots of queer theorists do acknowledge that they have become a kind of global discourse and they're anxious about it. But it seems to me we don't need to take on that anxiety in Caribbean studies because we have other more pressing, longer anxieties that we might need to deal with. I'm saying we and I'm stumbling on the we because I don't want to presume for other people. So I think we can't afford a kind of an idea of a sort of queer liberalism or a queer universal theory, which it seems to me queer theory is still committed to, some idea of universality. Yeah, I'm going to jump. So I suppose what I want to suggest then is that we might both go backwards to go forwards, but by that I don't mean that sense that, you know, the kind of Bob Marley sense that you have to know where you come from to know where you're going. It's kind of connected to that, but for me it's more a kind of simultaneity of temporalities, that sense that Harris talks about, that I think Jamaica Kincaid writes about frequently, particularly in that short story Ovando, where in a sense she wants to kind of step outside of history, even though she knows it's impossible, but that she has to step back to that 1492 moment to see what kinds of possibilities there are in that cultural moment in order to reimagine the structures differently. Whereas I think queer is still kind of linked too strongly to a kind of post Enlightenment kind of narrative of the subject. So I'm asking for a more generous, a more open kind of reading. So let me give you some examples. One might be to look at a writer like, to look at writers who don't obviously fit into what we think of as Creole writers. So we would all say Selvon in The Lonely Londoners, we'd probably all say Lovelace, we'd say Muta Baruka, we'd say Kamau Brathwaite. I'm sure we could quickly agree a list of names, Caribbean names, who you might associate with creolization. I want to suggest that we might look for in more unlikely places, in more unlikely texts, to see what kinds of possibilities emerge. And to my mind, when you do that, you do find texts where sexuality, ethnicity, gender are also tightly enmeshed that it's impossible not to talk about creolization. So I looked at one text I think is very interesting for that, is something like Jean Rhys's Let Them Call It Jazz. The whole debate about whether Jean Rhys is a white Creole or a West Indian or whatever, I think she's West Indian, and I think she speaks in ways that about sexuality that I think are very pertinent within the Caribbean, because she seems to me to expose a kind of the limitations of a patriarchal, heterosexist culture. But if you looked at something like Let Them Call It Jazz, it's much more akin to the voice of Sam Selvon's Lonely Londoners than we tend to want to recognize, because we want in a way to link that Creole voice with a certain kind of body. And I think because Jean Rhys's body is of a particular ethnicity, we tend not to recognize the voices coming from that body. So it would be to do something like that, to kind of recognize the ways in which she herself also, I think, kind of disguised her ethnicity in a sense in that text, because if you know that story, it's based on something that happened to her. This is part of her life experience of being put in jail for being drunk and disorderly. But she actually tells that story as if it's happened to someone who is mixed race. So she deliberately projects her own experience, mediates it through a body that is not like her own. And I think that's interesting, that she herself can't, articulate that voice, or feels she can't. Or to look at something like Phyllis Allfrey's story, I've forgotten the name. Oh God, how embarrassing. It's a short story from her collection, It Falls Into Place. Sorry, the name has just gone out of my head. Where she talks about a white mistress who is observing her two, and they're described as colored, servants in the garden. And the boundary between her desire for those women, her kind of surveillance of those women, what she projects onto those women, all of those things seem to me to be knotted up with a kind of same-sex desire, in which it is impossible to separate sexual difference from racial difference from class difference. All of those things are intersect in that story, even though the person doing the narrating is someone who is embedded in a marriage, a conventional, in a conventional marriage. So it would be to look at writers and texts that we don't usually think of as part of the creolizing canon, and to kind of bring them into the debate. It would be to look at, sorry, I realize now I'm running out of time, right? Is somebody, I look at my watch, but I never remember when I start.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah,
1 minute,
okay.
2 minutes.
2 minutes? Okay, it would be to look at things like Olive Senior, whose register of Creole voice is a much more economical kind of use of Creole. One or two slight, shifts in the language is enough to signal its creolizing potential, without having to locate it firmly and securely in a naturalistic representation of Creole. So that might be another strategy. Another might be, and I think this is probably the most contentious, would be to look at someone like Jamaica Kincaid, who in all of her work routinely literally brackets Creole speech, literally in brackets, but who talks about Creole speech as the language of the vanquished, as a language that can never speak, cannot be this kind of celebratory, happy hybridity discourse that we might want it to be. For Kincaid, Creole is the language of the vanquished. And I think it's quite interesting to take that argument and think about what it might mean, and even if you don't agree with it, kind of use it as a prompt to reconsider the ways in which we have become accustomed to thinking about creolization, and to try and kind of go back, far back, in order to come forward. I think I'm going to have to stop there, because time's up. Yeah, okay.